Hello everyone, this is Beth Eckert, and today I'm going to present a summary and critique of a nationwide survey to determine SARS-CoV-2 antibody prevalence in Brazil. The first case of COVID-19 was reported in Brazil on February 26, 2020. The surveys I'll be speaking about today were done in May and June of 2020, which was both very soon after the pandemic started and also now seems like a lifetime ago. The government response varied across city and state governments. Brazil is kind of like the United States in that there are 26 states and a federal district. So every state and also city kind of had their own approach to the pandemic. Throughout the country, testing was limited only to those who had the most severe symptoms, and contact tracing was minimal. So the actual prevalence of COVID-19 throughout the country was unknown. Researchers really wanted to get a good idea of how the pandemic was progressing across the country, so their three main objectives were to determine COVID-19 antibody prevalence by city and across the country, to analyze that information according to sex, age, ethnicity group, and socioeconomic status, and then to compare the prevalence of these estimates that they were getting with the official COVID-19 statistics. As I mentioned before, there were two different nationwide cross-sectional surveys done. One was done in May of 2020 and one was done in June of 2020. Interviewers went door to door and performed rapid point-of-care blood tests to test for COVID antibodies, and then had those who were selected answer questionnaires about demographic information. The point-of-care tests through previous validation studies had an 84.8 sensitivity and a 99.95 specificity. To pick the individuals who were tested, researchers chose 133 cities across all 26 states and the Federal District of Brazil, then chose 25 urban areas within those cities, then within those urban areas chose 10 random households, and when they got to the household, they randomly chose one of the individuals in the household. The only requirement was that the person had to be over 1 year of age. If that person did not want to participate, they left that house, and the researchers then went to the house to the right. 25,025 tests were performed in the first survey, and 33,250 tests were performed in the second. Nationwide prevalence was 1.6% in the first survey, and it was 2.8% in the second. Prevalence was higher in the north, especially in cities along the Amazon River. It was also higher among the indigenous population, in poor households, and in larger households. These results also showed that since official counts were only counting people who really were showing the worst symptoms, that cases were being way underreported and official numbers were only counting about 10% of the cases. There probably was some selection bias present in the study design. The population was very large and it was very methodically yet randomly selected, so a lot of bias is unlikely. However, there definitely was a lack of rural representation, as urban areas were only chosen within cities, thus leaving out rural areas. There was also some self-selection of non-response by individuals, or in some cases in law enforcement authorities, as sometimes interviewers were arrested and/or had their testing destroyed. There's very little chance of information bias, only really with the subjective information supplied by participants. And then there was a little bit of confounding taken into account. Researchers analyzed for confounding regarding ethnicity groups to determine if indigenous groups, really did have a higher prevalence as compared to other populations, and they indeed did. In addition to the already mentioned results, researchers had two other conclusions. One was that testing had a strong validity, as there was a high correlation between official rates from the cities and the estimated prevalence as determined by the antibody test. And you can also see that in the graph below. And also that continuing these surveys throughout the pandemic would be essential to monitor the progression of the pandemic, especially in light of the information that official counts were very underreported.